So all of this frustration and chaos and everything about what's going on in Kansas is going to start spreading into other places, and it's going to eventually start erupting in violence really all over the country. But first, we're going to see a lot of that violence happening in Congress. Now, remember, we've already been talking about some fights that have happened in Congress. I told you about the one with the guy Robert Toombs, where he got up and gave that speech about, how the South should just secede before the Compromise of 1850, and that whole fight broke out in Congress. Well, it's definitely not the first fight to happen in Congress, and it definitely won't be the last. So I'll tell you right now about one more situation, a really famous one where we see some specifically what goes on in Kansas start some violence in Congress. So on May 19th of 1856, this guy right here, Charles Sumner, he was a senator from Massachusetts and an abolitionist, gives a speech titled "The Crime Against Kansas." Okay, and when he says the crime against Kansas, he's saying that, slavery is the crime being perpetuated here in Kansas right now. And this fake or pro-slavery government, elected in a rigged election is a crime happening in Kansas. So he accuses hirelings, there's a quote, picked from the drunken spew and vomit of an uneasy civilization, of invading Kansas and attempting to impose a pro-slavery legislature. He's talking about those people coming from Missouri. Then he starts naming names and singling out specific people. First, he says, Senator from South Carolina, Andrew Butler, a guy named Andrew Pickens Butler. He says that he is the personification of that uneasy civilization, and he even calls him the pimp to the harlot of slavery. He says that he has chosen himself a mistress. Andrew Butler has, that it's slavery, and he's the pimp to the prostitute of slavery. He just goes on and on and on. So if you're someone from the South, someone from South Carolina, you're going to be absolutely, totally offended by all of this, and you're pissed. And one of those people is this guy over here, Preston Brooks. Preston Brooks was a representative from the state of South Carolina who also happened to be Andrew Butler's nephew. Okay, so not only has Charles Sumner just talked about the state of South Carolina and someone else that Preston Brooks knows, but he's talking about his family. Now, Preston Brooks feels like he has to defend Andrew Butler because Andrew Butler isn't even there. He just had a stroke, so he wasn't in Congress that day. Sort of a savage move to pick on a dude who wasn't there because he just had a stroke, but Charles Sumner was a savage kind of guy. So Preston Brooks is absolutely livid, and he wants to challenge Charles Sumner to a duel, because, that's what happens. But Preston Brooks has this best friend right here, Lawrence Keat, also a representative from the state of South Carolina, and he says absolutely not, that, you're not going to challenge him to a duel because Charles Sumner is a drunkard, and duels are for gentlemen, and this guy is no gentleman, and so you just might as well beat him. And Preston Brooks is like, that's an excellent idea. So on May 22nd of 1856, he goes into the Senate chamber to find Sumner making more copies of that same speech, the speech that he was so mad about in the first place. Sumner is literally sitting there hand-making copies. And Preston Brooks, supposedly says, I have read your speech twice, and it is a libel on South Carolina and Mr. Butler, who happens to be a relative of mine. And then he begins to beat Charles Sumner over the head with his brand new cane with a heavy gold head. Sumner tries to get away, but he just falls to the floor, ripping his desk out of the floor. Back then, they used to be bolted into the ground. And Brooks just kept beating him until his cane broke in two. When he hit him so hard the first time that Sumner went blind, okay? He said he had no intention of killing him, and that if he had an intention of killing him, then he would have chosen a different weapon. So Brooks is an equally savage type of person, clearly. So some people, obviously, as you would expect, tried to step in and help Charles Sumner and protect him, but Lawrence Keat holds them back and pulls out a gun and says, let them be, threatening to shoot anyone who goes in and helps him. So Sumner actually ends up suffering severe head trauma that causes chronic back pain, and he ends up having a traumatic brain injury, a TBI, as well as a severe case of PTSD, rightfully so. So Preston Brooks resigns from the House of Representatives because he says, I guess that was a little inappropriate of me, but he ends up being re-elected anyway in a write-in election. People write Preston Brooks' name in so many times that he wins in a landslide because people in South Carolina Carolina loved the fact that he just beat up this abolitionist dude. So Preston Brooks ends up being arrested, charged and convicted with assault, and fined $300, and that is his whole punishment. And then after that, dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of people start sending him new canes. They send him one that says "Good job." Another one they sent him was like gold plated, engraved with the words "Hit him again." The marketing department at the University of Georgia even sent him a cane. So like we've got some institutions that are still around today that sent Preston Brooks canes. A newspaper in Richmond, in Virginia, wrote, "We consider the act," talking about the beating, "good in conception, better in execution, and best of all in consequence. These vulgar abolitionists in the Senate must be lashed into submission." So basically everyone is saying, this is fantastic. We're obsessed with it. We're obsessed with you. You're rad. Preston Brooks is now a celebrity. Unfortunately, he ends up dying not shortly after. He dies at the age of 37 from liver disease. Big surprise. He was probably a bit of an alcoholic. So that's not the last we see of Lawrence Keat, though. He actually ends up attacking another congressman in 1858, chokes him, calls him a Negro lover. So he's clearly got a crazy racist violent streak in him. He actually ends up becoming a congressman in the Confederate Congress during the Civil War as well, fights in the Civil War. Not sure what happens to him after that. But as for Charles Sumner goes to Europe, actually, and has to get all of these new experimental medical treatments. Eventually, he gets better. He never gets his vision back, but he is able to walk again, and his spine sort of starts to heal. And he returns to the Senate in 1859, 1860, and in 1860 in June, he gives a brand new speech called "The Barbarism of Slavery," and it's considered to be one of the most passionate and incredible anti-slavery speeches ever given. And in it, he has this very famous quote where he says, "Say, sir, that you own the sun, the stars, and the moon, but do not say that you own a man endowed with a soul that shall live immortal, because the sun and moon and stars will eventually pass away."